So while the board was busy and running through an extended process in our search for a new executive director, we found him early this year, and we hired Guy Martin as our new executive director. Happy and excited to be here, Guy will now speak to his vision for OASIS. Guy, over to you.
Thanks, Gershon. So everybody, I am super excited to be here. Hopefully you're all staying well where you are. As you can see, I'm coming to you from my home office in Oregon, complete with my collection of Legos, including my Saturn V rocket. So some of you can probably figure out I'm a big space buff. Really excited about the potential launch later today of the SpaceX Dragon crew module. Fingers crossed for that one. But you've already heard about a lot of the great work that's been going on at OASIS that my fellow panelists have shared. And I'm excited to present what I think is my vision for the next generation of our organization, one that actually combines the proven track record that we have in standards work with the innovative and collaborative power of open source. So as you can see, I do come from the open source world. And if you actually kind of look at this comic, some people have asked why I started with this. This is actually what I started with in my interview with the board. So some of them got a kick out of this. But I think the main reason I put this up here is because this is sort of how OASIS is viewed by a lot of folks, and myself included early on in my career. This is the way that standards were sort of viewed as a little bit of a joke of, hey, you know, we're going to create yet another standard. But I think as time has gone by, both in my career and in my evolution of evaluating what's been going on at OASIS as I was looking to apply for this role, I've had an opportunity to kind of really look at that and change my perspective. And so my perspective is really informed by a couple of things. A couple of years ago, before I moved to Oregon, I was part of CAL FIRE, which is the state fire department in California, and I was privileged to serve with them for 10 years as a volunteer. And in that time, I was able to actually work in our communications division, and we were the ones who were responsible for all of the radio communications at incident bases. So my team ran a mobile command post that we went out and provided all of the support for battalion chiefs and others who were at incidents. And what was interesting there is we were using the P25 digital radio standard, so that some of you may have heard of. And so just that standard alone was the core of the infrastructure that we use to help firefighters on the line actually communicate and help them safeguard life and property. But what was interesting about that is as we were dealing with that, we actually had a challenge, which was that we had these laptops and we had to have a bunch of radios come in, because in a large wildland incident, you'll get firefighters from all over the world and sometimes just within your country that come and they bring all of their radios, and you have to try to get all the frequencies that you need for a particular incident. Well, the challenge is all of those radios are usually from different manufacturers. And so there was not a standard for how to, other than serial bus communication, for writing data to these radios. And it struck me as I was thinking through all of this that, you know, if there were a standard for that and an open source reference implementation that all of these vendors could have contributed to, that would have been the perfect mix of both worlds, right? A standard that actually allowed the interoperability and an open source reference implementation that multiple vendors could have contributed to, because in reality, there wasn't a lot of value add that they were going to build in everybody having their own individual radio writing program, and it would have helped the end user. So this is, I think, a great example of a mix of open source and standards. And I'd actually like to take this opportunity to go and look at another example of this. In our case, I think open standards are foundational. They're really the core value proposition that we have at OASIS. And coming in sort of as an open source person, one of the things that somebody asked me was, oh, are you planning on making it all about open source and not about open standards? And I really think that that's not the case. I think it's really important that we use the foundational core that we have of open standards, mix it with open source projects, as you've heard talked about in the Open Projects Initiative, and also think about what open source needs to do as far as a standardization path. And that's one of the beauties of what's been going on with the Open Projects Initiative, is this ability to do de jure standards within open source. I think it's an area that open source really needs to grow in, and OASIS is in a great place to do that. And so I think as we do that, that is really the value proposition and thought leadership that we bring as OASIS, this ability to effectively mix open standards with open source. So as an example of that, I was actually fortunate enough to help start what was called the Open Connectivity Foundation, which was an opportunity to take IoT devices. Some of you may know a lot of the different radio standards that are part of IoT today can be a bit of a nightmare sometimes for software developers. And what we did with the Open Connectivity Foundation, a joint effort between Samsung and Intel and others, was try to create an abstraction layer that made it a lot easier for application developers not to have to worry about all the different radio standards that were part of IoT devices. And it actually started as the standards activity, and you can see lately they've been able to become an ISO JTC1 PAS submitter, which has basically driven the standards part of the organization. But we also had, when I was there, just the IoTivity reference implementation. And as you can see, there's been 2 more reference implementations that have joined in the Open Connectivity Foundation. And one of the nice things is you can see a lot of the code commits, a lot of the releases, a lot of contributors to this open source work, which is both affecting the standard and also the standard being able to affect what goes into these open source reference implementations. So I use this as a great example of what I think we should be looking at OASIS, is this great synergy between the standards world and the open source world. So where do I see OASIS today? I actually ran an exercise with staff when I first came on board based on the book, The First 90 Days, which some of you may have read, from Michael Watkins. And he categorizes organizations in these 4 areas: startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, or sustaining success. And I had my own thoughts after reading the book and sort of working through the process of interviewing at OASIS, but I wanted the staff to kind of give me their perspective. And I actually asked some board members as well. And what was interesting is we were pretty much all aligned about where we thought OASIS was, which was right here, somewhere in between sustaining success, with obviously the great work that's been going on in the TC world, and a realignment. Basically looking at how we bring, again, open source, open projects, a lot of this more open and collaborative work from a code standpoint into OASIS. So I think it's really nice that we're all aligned around where we think OASIS is today, because it's going to be important as we reimagine what OASIS is in the future. And part of that reimagining is thinking about our brand. So I actually ran another exercise with staff that's ongoing as we've been thinking about what our current brand is and what we want our brand to be as we help move the organization forward. And so what has come from this is that we believe, and hopefully a lot of you agree, and I'd love to hear comments and questions about this later, we believe our brand right now is kind of this college professor, right? Somebody who's a very senior, trusted advisor, who's neutral, has a lot of domain expertise, really brings a lot of deep thinking value to the world of standards. But what can potentially be a problem there is that sometimes that's construed as maybe not as agile, maybe not as willing to embrace change and new things. And I think what we're looking to move our brand image to is capitalizing on the value that you have in this sort of college professor brand persona, but moving it to this kind of persona here, which is a business executive who kind of takes advantage of all of the previous value that's in the organization and brings together a diverse set of communities, as shown here, that actually helps take the best of what we've had from a standards perspective, marry it with open source, and marry it with these open and collaborative environments. So that leads into what I hope to see is OASIS tomorrow. I look at this Venn diagram of open source and open standards, with OASIS being in that sweet spot in the middle. And obviously, we're starting from a place of strength with open standards, and we're beginning to move more and more with the work that's going on in open source. And the goal is to increase that, obviously, again, not to overtake standards, but to get to a nice midpoint where open source and open standards are basically in a great mix between those two things. And that's where OASIS really sits and has a sweet spot. And to do that, we really need to take advantage of the great domain expertise we have in standards, but mix that, have a great mixing of minds and a great cognitive diversity that brings in different perspectives and different viewpoints, and really actually makes a more cohesive whole from the work that we've got going on in standards and a lot of the innovative work that goes on in open source today. And one of the ways we have to think about doing that is really thinking about what our processes look like, what our tools look like, what our engagement model looks like as the organization. And this is where I think there's already great work going on, and you heard from Brett Jordan earlier, and I think a lot of the great work Brett is doing around thinking about things like repository-based specification development, right? Using repositories, which is how open source already works, and actually being able to get some common tooling and some common processes. Obviously, there are going to be unique processes for both the open source side and the open standards side, but the more I think we can get to kind of a single community around this, it's going to be a lot better for OASIS in the long run. So COVID-19, obviously we're all living through this together, and wanted to touch on a couple of the things that have been going on here at OASIS around this. I think the most important thing to think about is from a business continuity and safety standpoint. This work has started even before I became the executive director, but it's one of the things that I'm most proud of. We have, obviously, our HQ staff has been working from home. I know that they're going back this week. They're excited about that, but they have been working from home successfully. The rest of the staff, including myself, are already remote. But I think the most important thing to me, especially as I was evaluating OASIS as an opportunity for a career, was collaboration. Remote collaboration is already in the DNA of the organization, right? It's been one of the things that's been a pioneering part of what OASIS has done in the standards world, is said, hey, we don't necessarily have to have a ton of meetings. We have a great remotely collaborative workflow and processes. And as you heard Frederick mention, we have a solid and conservative financial plan, which is helping us to weather this COVID-19 situation and actually move forward. But beyond business continuity and safety, I think one of the things that I'm super proud of is that we're doing our part. If you look at the emergency management technical committee standards like EDXL and hospital availability, they're already in use for mitigation efforts, which is fantastic. And obviously, as a former first responder, those are near and dear to my heart. But I think the work that's going on in the Ethereum Open project, and Baseline specifically, is also very interesting. Baseline is attempting to work on helping the privacy of contact tracing apps be a lot more robust, and this is the contact tracing app infrastructure that's being put in place by Google and Apple. And also in the European world, the AS4 standard is being considered for data exchanges for COVID-19 information. I asked the staff to pull together kind of all of these examples and everything we're doing. And if you go to oasis-open.org/COVID, you'll see all of the great work that's going on there. And that's something we're going to continue to make sure that we update as we go forward. So as we move forward, what are some things that are top of mind for me? I think one of the big things, and staff and the board have heard this very clearly from me, coming in from an outside perspective, it's very clear that we want to clarify and strengthen the OASIS brand. And part of that is a website refresh, which I know a lot of folks are probably excited about. I know I'm excited about it. It's one of the things that I think is going to help us make really clear our value proposition to new potential OASIS members and new open project sponsors, is having a great website that really reflects the brand and the strengths that we bring as an organization. Also, increasing our presence in the European Union is actually a core thing that I'm really excited about. So we already have a great staff there, Dr. Carol Cosgrove-Sachs and Pim van der Eyck, and we're actually working to create an European Stichting, European entity, which will allow us to be able to take in work in the EU, apply for grants, and actually strengthen our position in the EU. And I think it's really important in light of COVID. The reality is that the European Union is probably going to end up moving past the COVID situation a little faster than those of us in North America. And I think that's important for us to make sure that we're in a great position to take advantage of opportunities when COVID-19 passes there. Another part of, I think, what we're really looking forward to doing is actually doing outreach to key open source projects to help promote a standardization path. And this can be anything from bringing them in to host them as an open project, but also maybe providing guidance in a way that they can get to a standardization path, even if they choose to host somewhere else. So I think this is a really, really key important thing as we go forward. It's, again, our ability to take open source and open standards and merge them in a significant way. And as part of that, I think OASIS is in a great position in the areas that we have really strong relationships already in government, financial, medical, and other highly regulated industries that are generally based, their procurement processes are based on standards. We have an opportunity to be the thought leaders in demystifying what open source means for those organizations. And having spent some time in US Department of Defense doing consulting for building what was Forge.mil, an initial open source type of community, I think I've seen this firsthand that there really still is a lot of work to be done, and OASIS is in a great place to actually make that happen. And finally, we need to be providing steady leadership both during the situation and after COVID-19. And as you've heard from Frederick, we are in a great position, I think, financially, and through the great work of Scott McGrath, our COO, and Kathy Mayo, our controller, and the work that Frederick has put in from a board oversight perspective. Those are things that are going to really help us going forward. I think the most important thing that I want to leave you with, though, is our own Jory Burson, who runs our open projects community efforts, had a great quote when she wrote about this in 2018, where she talked about open source and standards definition organizations having to work together for the platform of the future and being the champions of that platform. And so I'm really excited to be here. I think this is a great opportunity for OASIS right now, and I think it's a great opportunity for OASIS in the future. Thank you very much.